Okay, today we are going to talk about blocking muslin. I have a few supplies on hand. I'm working on my cutting mat, and this is just to kind of help me measure along and also square my corners. I have a mechanical pencil, some scissors, and a clear graph ruler, and then also my muslin fabric that we're going to be working with. So I'm going to open up my fabric. I have a portion cut off from a roll. Your muslin might have come on a bolt or also be cut off of a roll. However it was, I want you to look for the selvage. So I have my selvage edge here, and that is identified by, there's a fairly like opaque border on this edge, and then it has some like green thread woven through, and then this like pretty consistently frayed edge. My other frayed edge here is really inconsistent, right? It doesn't have that kind of uniformity. Same thing with the other side. This is like extremely fuzzy. And so parallel to my selvage here, I'm going to find it over here. Okay, all I want you to do is identify it. My next step is I'm going to mark my grain line. So the lengthwise grain of the fabric is always parallel to that selvage. I'm going to go ahead and give myself a big directional arrow. That's to help me identify where it is. And I'm making that about 1 inch in from the selvage edge. So this is my lengthwise grain. I'm going to completely remove the selvage. We are working on a project using 10 by 10 inch blocked squares. So I'm going to show you how to prepare those materials. But I want to make sure that my grain line is moved inward enough so that it does not disappear when I remove the selvage. Okay, so I want it to be on my piece of fabric. It won't interfere with anything we're doing, and it will tell me the direction of the fabric that I should be working on. Okay, so my first step is I want to make sure that all of my edges are torn. If you have something that looks like a cut edge right here, I want you to remove it. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to remove the cut edges on the cross grain. I'm snipping in just enough to remove that selvage, right? If I snip into the selvage but not all the way past, it won't allow me to tear it. So I need to go just a little bit further. And then I'm going to go ahead and tear the edge of my fabric all the way across. All right, from selvage edge to selvage edge, okay? So I can go ahead and get rid of that. From that line that I just tore, I'm going to go ahead and measure up about 10 inches. It's okay to give yourself like a little bit more. Sometimes the fabric does not tear evenly. So I'm going to go ahead and mark my 10 inches right here. Right, I'm at maybe 10 1/4 here, but it looks like it dips off, right? But that 10 is fine. And at that point, I'm going to go ahead and tear. So I'm leaving the selvage on the piece that I'm not working with right now. This will become my active piece. I'm going to tear it. It's important to leave that selvage on to the piece that you're not working with so you still understand where the grain line is in the future. I can set that aside, and now I'm ready to start dividing my 10 inch by 10 inch squares. So I'm going to measure from approximately where I'm going to remove my selvage. Again, this is about 1/2 inch in, so I want to take off a little extra just to make sure I get rid of that glued edge. Again, if I don't get rid of that glued edge, it's really locking those fibers in place, so it will not allow me to block them. So what I'm going to do is make a mark about 1/2 inch from the edge of the fabric, or actually from the opaque edge of my selvage. Everybody's will look different. Some people's will be kind of like a woven twill pattern on the diagonals. Some people's will just be a really frayed edge. Some might be perforated holes. It appears differently, but it's always there in a woven fabric, and it's parallel to the length of the fabric. So measuring 10 inches over leaves me right here. So I'm going to make a little tick mark. That'll be where I cut my fabric. And then next to it, I'm immediately going to go ahead and draw the grain line on my next piece. So I'll always have a directional arrow on the piece that I'm working with, right? And I just want to move it over to make sure that they're consistent so they don't lose track of which side is which. I'm going to go ahead and snip to remove my selvage and tear my fabric again. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and isolate my first square. Again, the arrow is going to be on the piece that I'm not working with to help me out in the future. And I'm using my cutting table to help illustrate what happens with muslin when it is not blocked. So blocking is really the process of aligning fibers or realigning fibers in a woven fabric. Theoretically, the way that fabric is woven, everything is on a perfect grid with 90-degree angle or 90-degree right angles in between each fiber. However, depending on the heat processes and starch that's added to the muslin, which is a really inexpensive cotton fabric, the fibers get skewed. So we want to realign them before we start working to prevent any garment or item that we make from like twisting at the seams or especially after washing. When I line up my corner here, we can see that the fabric is particularly off, right? So by lining up here, it's coming below this line and over this one. So what I want to do is I want to start working from one corner and start pulling on the fabric on the diagonal. So this diagonal is called the bias. If you've heard of a bias cut gown or a bias slip, this is what they're referring to. The lengthwise grain of the fabric parallel to the length of it, or the straight grain as it's also known as, has the least amount of stretch in a woven fabric. So you can see the fabric has a little bit of bounce, just a tiny bit of give. When our patterns are aligned on a piece of cloth, 99% of the times we're lining up the grain of the pattern with the direction, the lengthwise grain of the fabric. And that's because our bodies really don't have any stretch vertically. We never get taller throughout the day. Our cross grain would be on the width of the fabric. And so here when I pull on it, you can see there's a little bit more elasticity between the fibers. It has a little bit more give. And think about this, like as we go through the day, we need a little bit of stretch around our stomachs, legs, etc. So this is going to go around our width. And then the bias is the truly elastic part of the fabric. There's the most amount of space on the diagonal between those fibers, so it allows us to stretch the fabric without having any seams. So I'm going to go ahead and stretch it. Blocking is always done prior to ironing. The heat from the iron actually locks in the fibers in place. So we want to make sure that it's always done before we iron. So when that's done, I'm going to realign it and just check out what my fabric looks like. I always tell my students, I want you to go for 95% corrected from where we started. It's really hard to get it to be 100% correct, right? But we want to do as much as we can. So here I can definitely still see that I'm off using the right angles. You can use any corner surface that you have, so it doesn't have to have any measurements on it. As long as you have a table or a counter with a right angle, that's perfect. You cannot tear the fabric by blocking it. It will not shred or anything, so you can be pretty forceful with it. And the fabric is very forgiving, again, as long as we do this before we iron. Okay. All right, that seems to be much improved. So I'm going to go ahead and set this piece aside, and I'll show you the process again with my next piece. So the goal is to do 6 of these, to have 6 total. We're going to be working on 10 by 10 squares, and they'll each be, we're gonna do 3 squares, they'll each be 2 ply, so we'll need 6 total. So again, from this edge, I already know my vertical is 10 inches. I'm going to measure over 10 inches for the width, which is right here. And then I'll make my grain line on the following piece. Snip my fabric. And then start blocking on the diagonal. So I work all one way, and then I work from the opposite corner. So what I like to do for this process is really block all of my pieces so then I can do all of my ironing at once. And then I'm ready to sew. So really think about it as batch production. Okay, so this piece actually looks a lot better than the first. And that's all there is to it. I can go ahead and get started with ironing.